Brandon Hill.
Brandy Hill.
Mark Spain.
Leah Freiberger.
Tim Osborne.
Dina Despain.
Greatness is a very open idea when it comes to baseball. Babe Ruth, Barry Bonds, and Mike Trout are some of the greatest of all time and have arguments to who is the greatest. Babe Ruth will be said as one of the greatest of all time because of the way he pitched and hit like no other. Barry Bonds is said because of the home runs and his eye at the plate. Mike Trout is said because of how great he is overall as a baseball player. The argument for all of these are there, however stats cannot be the leading factor in them because of the aging game of baseball, expected and predicted stats, injuries and drugs, and comparing stats that simply do not make sense. First, with the aging game of baseball. Baseball was invented in the 1840s and the first professional game was played in the 1860s. This was a long time ago, and in the past 20 years, the fastball velocity of the pitcher have went up 4 miles per hour. That means in the early 2000s, pitchers pitched around 89 to 90 miles per hour on average, and now they are about 93 to 94. That it is only a 20-year difference, and Babe Ruth, put it in perspective, played in the 1920s. That is almost 100 years. Now, it may not be an exact curve, however, the skill and improvement of players is shown right there in that fact. The skill in 100 years ago, or even 200 years ago, is greatly different than the skill of today's game. Things that has also changed with the game of baseball over time is the equipment. The glove was simply padding over all 5 fingers at the beginning of baseball. Now it is a web that can be up to 13 inches, which makes it easier for defenders to play defense. Another change would be the bat. The bat used to be ash and used to break often and not hit balls as hard. Now many bats are maple, which hit balls harder and last longer from game to game. The last thing that changed over the game of baseball is simply the ball. The ball has changed leather on the outside, the stitching, and many other things, and changed over time, which creates a different type of play. The next thing is rules and violations also changed with the game of baseball. One rule that was recently added to the game of baseball was the pitch clock. This makes pitchers pitch the ball to a batter in a certain amount of time. This not only speeds up the game itself and total time played, but also how fast the pitcher's got to be. This can mess up his rhythm or his timing, which can make it easier for batters to capitalize on the mistake of the pitcher. Expected and predicted stats are also a way that stats are invalid. Expected stats, such as expected batting average, expected slugging, and expected WOBA, which is quality of contact plus strikeouts plus walks, are all expected stats. These expected stats are different than actual stats, or they are based off of different factors. Expected stats kind of take the luck out of actual stats. Expected stats are based off where players or where fielders are playing, where how hard the ball is being hit, where the game is being taken place, and many other factors. To put this in perspective, Trey Turner is second in the league in batting average right now at a 349. His expected batting average, however, is 286, which is 27th in the league. This is almost a 60-point drop, and this shows how much of luck comes into batting average. His expected batting average being 60 points lower shows that he is having a great season for his team stats-wise, however, is not actually as a baseball player perspective. Predicted stats can also be very crazy in baseball. From predicting stats to how good a player is going to be the year after, or if they get injured, how good they would have been, are very inaccurate as baseball is a game of streakiness. Momentum plays a huge role in the game of baseball, and if the momentum's on your side, you tend to be doing better, and when you predict, you cannot really tell this. The next point is injuries and drugs. Common baseball injury in baseball is the UCL. This is oftentimes fixed by Tommy John surgery, which takes a year to recover from. Other common injuries are to the back, legs, and labrum of baseball players. These all can take surgery or just rehab, which takes months or maybe a year, if not a little more, to come back from. To put this into perspective, one of the greatest of all time, mentioned in the beginning, Mike Trout, who was drafted in 2009, misses about 41 games a year due to injury. He hasn't played over 150 games since 2016. This means that we will never get to know how truly good Mike Trout would have been if he would have played all or maybe most of those games due to his injuries. Also, another popular Another youthful player that was really good that had an injury was Ronald Acuna Jr., who had an ACL injury a few years ago at the age of his 24th season. He was a youthful star in his peak, and after this injury, it took him almost 9 months to recover from. This can greatly affect how a player comes back or how his peak will be once he comes back. Next up is drugs. Performance-enhancing drugs have been a big thing in baseball ever since the start. PEDs were always around baseball and always have been. Another great mentioned in the beginning, Barry Bonds, played in the steroid era, which was in the 90s to 2000s. This is when people started getting caught more and had more court cases on performance-enhancing drugs in the league, as it was more apparent. Barry Bonds leads all of the MLB in home runs. However, you can say that he used these PEDs to farther help him get these home runs. There used to be no test, and then now in the 90s and 2000s, they started gathering this information on how many people actually use these drugs, and now there are frequent tests that are random or scheduled throughout the year. One player that was affected by these tests is Fernando Tatis Jr., who's another young star of 25 who plays for the Padres, and he missed 80 games a few years back due to these drugs. These drugs can not only help a player's stats, but can hurt a player, as Fernando Tatis Jr. missed out on 80 games, which is a great deal this season. It can greatly downgrade his stats or even change how he plays when he gets back. Next is comparing stats that simply do not make sense. Babe Ruth had a WAR of 182.2 and Barry Bonds had a WAR of 162.2. WAR is wins above replacement. This is simply how many wins you add to a team in your career. Now you may say Babe Ruth is 20 wins above Barry Bonds, so he's automatically better. However, this is not the case because Babe Ruth played the infield and also pitched. When you play the infield, you add to your WAR higher than if you play the outfield. Same thing with pitching. Another stat that is not always accurate is average. When you think of a Hall of Famer, you think a Hall of Famer is going to be better than average, or in the Hall of Fame, you're going to be right around the same numbers. However, Mike Cameron, Hall of Fame, second ballot Hall of Famer from the Kansas City Royals, who won multiple World Series, had a batting average of .249 for his career. This is below the league average of today's game. So a below average player in today's game is in the Hall of Fame. This shows that this average may not be telling the true story. His true story is probably with his World Series, his defense, or other factors like other players, but these stats do not show it. A great way in baseball to determine greatness in a player is the eye test. This is because a lot of stats are subjective. What stat's the best? Batting average, on base, slugging, and many others are there, but no one knows the best. It's because there is no best. If you want a pure hitter, you go for average. If you want a guy who gets on base, it's on base percentage. If you want a guy who hits for power, it's slugging. This stat can be often changed depending on who you're looking at and who is the best. So in conclusion, greatness is based off stats and bias. However, stats should no longer be a valid point and should not tell the full story of who is the greatest of all time. So next time you're having the greatest of all time talk, do not use stats as a main point or a main reason in why a certain player is the best of all time.
Dina Despain.
Brandon Hill.
Brandy Hill.
Mark Despain.
Leah Freiberger.
Tim Osborne.